I've been in technology literally my whole life. I'm going to be 70 soon. I started out in software as an engineer, actually on mainframe software. I worked for a mainframe application software company in the 70s, and then started going along for my own. I ended up getting into COBOL as a compiler writer. And my partner and I wrote what was one of the first mainframe compatible COBOL compilers in the 80s called Realia. That company did fairly well, but we sold it in 91. Through that sale, I ended up becoming part of Computer Associates. I worked at Computer Associates for 9 years, the last 4 or 5 of which I ran worldwide marketing. And then I went into venture capital. And in venture capital, it was 2000, and I was investing in systems management software and other types of software like that, security software. I did that for about 10 or 11 years. At that one fund, that fund ended. We had a bunch of some good success with some great companies. And then sort of went off on my own, doing investing, helping companies. In 2018, I got a phone call from the founder of VirtualZ, Jeannie Glass, who said that we had met at Computer Associates, but she had an idea for a mainframe software company. And would I give her some advice? And fast forward, it's been 7 years. We built VirtualZ together, and the company is not the original products that they were going to build are not what we ended up doing. We ended up really focusing on this very tight integration between mainframes and the cloud. I'm the executive chairman, and that's sort of how we came to be. So I would say that I'm technical in that I was a system software developer for years. I certainly know COBOL. I am a bit of an amateur when it comes to AI. I mean, I understand it. I mean, I dealt with neural networks in the 90s, so I know the of I'm I'm a somewhat of an optimist in how it's affecting the world. I understand your world of data probably more from a technical point of view than from where you're sitting. Um, so I hope to learn a bit about that from you as well. And I'm excited to have the conversation.
Awesome. Yeah, there's a pretty good chance that I've used some of the stuff that you've worked on at some point in the past.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's just interesting to me how back then, 20, 30, 40 years ago, we were so focused on how we built products, how they were constructed, you taking analyst information and turning them into programmers, that a lot of the issues, like I even talked to people about Y2K, there were some legitimate reasons why programmers did things that would have failed during the Y2K. But no one really, in the 70s, the last thing you thought about was having to do a 4-digit year.
Mhm.
Because you were just worrying about getting the accounts receivable system working,
Right, right.
and trying not to waste storage, which back then was super expensive, right?
Yeah, it's very precious. Yep.
And now CPU is free and storage is free. So now we're more focused on these ancillary issues. They're important, but we just didn't focus on them back then.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I worked, for many years for a company that, was the custodian of the world's largest bibliographical database. So if you went to a library, anywhere, and you went to the computer in the library and you typed in a resource that you were looking for, that metadata came from the company that I'd worked for, and I built a lot of their infrastructure for a very, very long time. The database that housed all of that metadata was on a a purpose-built, customized, database management system, and then made a migration to Oracle 9. So this was on ZOS, on a mainframe that had been around for quite some time. Um, but then, even outgrew, Oracle 9, so, made the migration to, more, Hadoop more of a Hadoop solution, as opposed to staying strictly on Z. But I led a lot of the efforts to move some of those applications from Z to commodity systems. So we used a lot of products from
Did it first move from Z Oracle to non-Z Oracle, and then move to a no SQL or a Hadoop environment?
straight from Z Oracle to a Hadoop
Oh,
environment.
wow.
So at one point, it was the largest Hadoop cluster, this side of the Mississippi. I don't know. I don't know if it still is, but it's several hundred nodes within the cluster, and the data set itself is in the multiple petabyte range. So it houses a lot of metadata, and it also houses things like there's the primary database, the primary metadata data store, which is called WorldCat, and then there are multiple other data stores that are underneath it that are like LexisNexis, a lot of specific domain or domain specific data sets that are underneath that. Even medical metadata data sets that are underneath it. So yeah, so chances are at some point in my career, I'd worked with something that you had built back in the 80s or 90s.
It's very possible. I'm curious, so w the is metadata management, is that a role that is very common, like, in corporations these days? Give me a sense of what that role is, and uh, what are those people's responsibility?
Hmm. So it's less common as a role, as a primary role for an organization that is their reason for existence, right? That's not. There are very few companies that actually do that. Um, of course, if you want to, think of, the big players like Google and Meta as being, metadata, companies, which they certainly are. They just have different missions, right? So for someone who is, strictly in metadata management, a lot of the things that they're doing is, looking at very, very large data sets to ensure compliance with specific standards. Like if you're in the library world, you're looking for, Marc, machine readable cataloging standards, AACR2, all sorts of different standards that make it possible to be able to manage and retrieve information, because that's the difference between making usable metadata and just a bunch of stuff that's littering a data set, right? So that's largely what metadata management is all about, is ensuring retrieval. If you're looking for, something like, companies that have different missions, something that's more in the monetization range, you're looking at how can you leverage metadata to either monetize it yourself, or to monetize an associated product, right? So something that metadata refers to. So if you're like Amazon, or um, well, let's use Amazon. Metadata is extremely important to Amazon, because that is a direct reference to products that they have available for sale, and there's a lot of analytics that are performed on that metadata. not just to understand, what's being sold, but, how to price appropriately and, how to, and even going as far as to say, so we see the 900,000 vendors that we have on Amazon. What metadata can we pull regarding those products, and the associated analytics to figure out, what we should put in, what products we should sell as Amazon basics, right? So there's a lot of effort that's spent on metadata management. Now, are they going to be, um, spending a lot of time trying to, manage and update standards that are available for other people to follow, like Dublin Core Metadata Initiative or something like that? Probably not. They're probably not going to spend as much time as, say, a not-for-profit organization that's their reason for being, right? But it's not to
So
say.
how is metadata management and data governance, are they orthogonal? Are they the same thing? Is metadata management a subset of data governance?
Metadata is the language of data governance,
I
right?
see. Okay.
So if you are looking to, say, this is a lot of thing. This is something that a lot of people kind of like maybe gloss over about data governance, is that data governance has to have a specific purpose, right? You can't just say, well, we're going to govern all of our data everywhere, regardless of its purpose. You're saying that the lawn mowing schedule on your headquarter campus is just as important as, say, the.
Personal information on a patient or something like that, right?
Exactly, exactly. I mean, they're not born the same. They're not, used for the same purpose. They don't have the same importance. So what you're really interested in doing is, taking the data that is the most critical to your organization. So if you are healthcare, your patient data is the most critical data that you can have. So what is important about that patient is reflected in the metadata associated with that patient. So everything that you can define in terms of what is important about that patient, and what, the associated quality of those data elements that are associated with that patient, that's all reflected in the metadata, about that patient. So everything like, vital statistics. I mean, that's metadata. It is descriptive of your patient. So when you're putting together, a data governance program, and you're also putting together a data quality program, you have to understand what the standards are. So we started talking, earlier about, who would have thought that a 4-digit date in a year would have been important. Well, it's pretty important when you're talking about, say you're talking about, an office that handles, quite often handles, um, it's less of an option now, or less of a circumstance now, but there could have been people that were born before
Oh,
1900
it
or
was but
2000.
that was one of the tricks, that was one of the tricks that caused a lot of problems, is that what we did is because we just said, "Okay, if the number is less than X, then we treat the person as over 100 years old." And it's in fact, it's funny, I don't know, there was, during this Doge discussion, there was some people talking about these people that are 150 years old, and they in fact weren't. It was one of those tricks.
Exactly.
They didn't understand the metadata of the date fields when you're constrained, and programmers did all these tricks in order to basically compress the information into 2 digits.
Absolutely. And these are tricks that people who are, yeah, not disparaging, anyone on a Doge team or anything, but, the kids that are in their 20s probably would not have understood that. They grew up
Well,
in a
that's
different.
the thing, it's back to what we were talking about, right? The we all grew up in a time where, as a programmer, you had to do things as efficient as possible in storage and in compute,
Mhm.
and much of that is gone now. Much of that is, is it's not there. I mean, I spent years trying to make things tighter and smaller, and and a lot of that work is just not necessary anymore.
Yeah. And if we take this, to the modern era, the question about metadata management, if we drew the comparison or the relationship between metadata management and data governance, and saying that metadata management is absolutely crucial to data governance, you can draw that even further. So if you're looking to build anything that is a product, that is created using data. So it doesn't really matter what it is, report, a dashboard visualization. If you're a publicly traded company, your 10K, 10Q, it doesn't really matter what it is. That is a product. Now, draw that parallel to products that are developed using artificial intelligence. Right. So you can see that, if you're building something, leveraging artificial intelligence, the data on the back end is absolutely critical to, the overall quality of that, just as critical as the model itself that the product is based off of. Now, how do you know that the data is the appropriate data to use for that product that was, built leveraging artificial intelligence? Well, the metadata that is associated with that data is going to give you the language that is necessary for evaluation, right? Now you've got that direct line from, the data set itself and how important that data set is to the overall, value of the product that's being generated out the other end. It's not just saying, hey, data governance is doing something, and now we've got this perfect data. That's not the appropriate way to look at it. The appropriate way to look at it is that we've done something and we can verify that it's, operating the way that we want it to operate, especially if it's a data product like a report, dashboard, visualization, any of your regulatory reporting. But then we can also say, if it's something that you're generating AI for, so say it's something that is, a decision-making tool, you can say with a higher degree of certainty that if there's something that is off kilter, from, in your results, it's not because of the data. It's something that may be in your model. But also you want to make sure that, what you're feeding the model is responsible. It's reflecting reality appropriately. There are situations where, like, say you're in the banking industry, and you want to ensure that your loan portfolio is not negatively impacting or is not showing or intentionally negatively impacting a specific demographic segment. You want to make sure that the data that you're feeding into your model is going to, show not just the reality of your, customer demographics, but you want to make sure that even your potential customer demographics are not going to be, treated unfairly, as you're extending credit to any demographic. So the data that you're pulling in has to be, free of as free of bias as you can possibly be, right?
Yeah, is there anything specific to AI that has changed data governance? Like, I mean, aside from, I know that with LLMs, there's a lot of issues, right? Where's this data coming from? Is it legitimate? Is it, but in general, is how is data governance as a field changing with AI?
I think, well, it's the standard answer is, the input and the outputs, right? So the inputs into the data governance process, are being impacted by artificial intelligence. We have much better tools nowadays than we used to. Even a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, now a lot of tools like Calibra, Precisely, Alteryx, they're starting to add or data.world, data galaxy, they're all starting to integrate a lot more tools into their platforms to help data governance teams be much more effective and efficient, which is great, right? Now all of that input is being pushed to potential outputs, potential data products, like the dashboards, visualizations, reports, all that kind of stuff. And now it's also for data products that are being leveraged in artificial intelligence. That's one part. The other part is, I think from a profession, there used to be, well, there still is, right? There are organizations that are designed to support, train, educate, people that have been in traditionally various fields. There are organizations that are specific to data governance. Traditionally, data governance has looked at more structured data and have gone into the realm of unstructured or semi-structured data. Now we're seeing data governance that's as a profession that is bleeding more into what would technically be referred to as information governance, or how does what is traditionally uh, determined as unstructured data or semi-structured data, documents in SharePoint, in any documentation management or content management
Yeah,
system.
this is
All
it's
those.
very interesting that you bring this up because it was one of the questions that I had, and again, it comes from my background. You know, when you look at, let's talk about records in a database, there's always a choice between which fields you make explicit data choices, metadata choices for, and which you don't, right? You would always have notes fields, you would always have text fields, and then what would happen is the users of those applications would start using those things. And then you would be talking to a business analyst and they said, oh, yeah. And you say, well, we're going to take that notes field and we're going to change it. And they would say, oh, no, 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 don't change it. We use the first three characters to indicate something. And then you realize, oh my gosh, these people, these users just created metadata and they didn't even know it. And we, as the technical team, we didn't even know it. And does that still happen in this world?
Oh yeah, all the time. And that the thing is that you know uh, if you're talking to, I guess it all depends on who you're talking to, right? If you're talking to an executive, they'll think that data is the easiest thing on the face of the planet. And it's a very rare executive who understands that data is like water. It goes everywhere. Everyone's using it all at the same time. It very easily turns into a swamp, right? Everyone's heard the data lake versus data swamp thing. Very easily turns into a swamp. You can have applications, you can have systems. So we started talking about mainframes and uh, transitioning mainframe applications to commodity hardware. It's still the same data,
Right.
back end, so you can have data that's been around for 50, 60 years on applications that have been built within the last two. So,
Well, that's an example of it. Social security system is a good example of that. I'm sure your bibliographical database has that element. I mean, I don't know how much. I don't know how much. Does anything ever get purged from that database, by the way, or is that add only? Is that
it depends on if you're trying to update and remove what is truly a duplicate. And that's one of those areas because, that bibliographic database is based off of a consortium, and that's a whole collection of, I think it's like 50, 60,000 libraries around the world that upload their metadata, and metadata is purchased from publishers, And sometimes what you get from publishers is just riddled with duplication, 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 right? Because it's almost like, they want to get paid by the word. Yeah, paid by the metadata tag, right?
But there's no unique identifier across all this data. Like is ISBN or I don't need to go into this, but is that's one of the problems when you don't have a globally agreed upon unique identifier, right?
Right. Yeah, but there could be a globally unique identifier. You can use ISBN, you can use any there are multiple different standards for globally unique identifiers. The problem is that you can assign a globally unique identifier and there could be multiple editions that are for different markets, right? So you would have to have an identifier that shows that, there's a page difference because it's for the UK market and, they spell color with a U, right? So there could be, indicators that show that it's the same material. It's just meant for a different market, but it may have the same identifier. So identifying, duplicates is not as easy as it may seem. Now stretch that to, say like an insurance company where you may have, multiple people that are in the same household and this is a mastering issue, a data mastering issue. You may have multiple people in the same household that have the same name but forget to, show either their social security number or something that would differentiate them, say father, son, grandson that have the same name. So it becomes a mastering issue. In the library world, it's fairly similar, but there are a lot of different metadata tags that may tell you, yeah, as to whether or not it's the same material or if it's a different, same material, but have a different purpose for a different market, right?
So is there anything it's going back to mainframe again, the experience that you described where you moved from a SQL database, Oracle 9 running on the mainframe to Hadoop. I mean, was there anything specific to the mainframe that data set had that you had to really, um, modify when you moved it to this open environment? And give me a just walk me through that a little bit.
Yeah, it was, I wouldn't necessarily call it a lift and shift, because that's doing a disservice to the people who worked very hard to get it to Hadoop. Um, it it um the company had worked really hard, with Oracle when building the data model, for all of that data. It was a purposely built data model, for this bibliographical data, um, as it was when, they were using the original purposed custom built, database management system. And this was built for the company by the company, right? The original one.
Was the original one a relational model, or was it a specific network model for that data type? Okay. It was relational, but it was custom.
Yes, yes, very much so. So when it went to Oracle, it lasted there for probably the better part of a decade, I believe. This is old information. I haven't worked for the company for about a decade. Um, but yeah, they had shifted that to Hadoop specifically because Oracle, it didn't matter if it was running on a mainframe or not. The complexity and the size just got too difficult for a relational model to handle. So the compute power, the responsiveness on the storage on the back end, even though, mainframe is still venerated, it's still viable technology. Anybody who says it's not, it's probably not. It probably has something they're trying to sell. It was just not able to handle, regardless of whether it was on Oracle 9 at the time or not, was not able to handle the size and complexity and the amount of transactions that were requested, concurrently, right? So that's why, it had to go on to Hadoop. Now, there wasn't really a lot of changes that were done to, performed on the data model itself, at least initially. Now it has evolved and it's grown, but there a lot of what had been done was actually pretty pioneering at the time. Now, should they have done something different? That's a technical question that, in the future, I'm sure they may
Yeah, I
reevaluate.
mean, my guess is the transformation from a relational database to Hadoop was probably instigated not just by for technical reasons, but for budget reasons too, because that they probably decided that to increase the size of the mainframe or to have some sort of clustered environment with multiple copies of the Oracle database was so costly that it would be better to spend the effort to migrate to a Hadoop environment where the hardware cost, is dramatically less. That you can just replicate that. So it's not just a technical reason, but a budget reason too.
And there are maintenance costs. I mean, I had worked with for some time the last mainframe administrator that the company had hired, and he retired. So mainframe administrators are far and few between. Whereas Hadoop administrators, they're
It's a
relatively.
growing business in some
Yeah,
respect. Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah, um, so let's walk a little bit forward in your career. Give me a sense of the work that you did, as the chief data officer, and at Northwest rather.
Sure. Yeah. So I was the chief data governance and privacy officer for Northwest. I had served for a short period of time. It almost sounds like a military operation, but yeah. But I was kind of sort of an interim CDO for a short period of time. Now, that's not something that I had actually aspired to do, largely because Northwest, like many organizations, is an organization in transition, but not necessarily sure of exactly from what to what. They're a 115-year-old institution, grew to about 24 billion in assets under holding, wants to become a commercial bank. However, the difference between a retail bank and a commercial bank are pretty stark, right? Everyone wants to chase after the retail market or the commercial market because the margins on loans for commercial are so much more favorable than retail. It's like you get an auto loan, that's what, 30, $40,000, whereas commercial 30, 40 million, right? So, um, so
And it's probably the same amount of effort.
right, right. So when I came into Northwest, I was brought on board by the CDO at the time, to address some regulatory findings. Every institution has them. No shame in that, but these are things that really needed to be addressed. So I was hired specifically to build a data governance program and a data quality program. But as soon as I came in and started reading some of the text from the regulatory findings, it became pretty clear that the regulators weren't going to stop there. There were multiple things that were gaps for the organization because they grew from a smaller institution past the $10 billion mark, which is where FDIC starts paying attention to you much closer. So they didn't necessarily spend a lot of time, investing in these areas, content management, records and information management. data protection and privacy. Not that they didn't pay attention to those things, but it was not necessarily their
It wasn't as rigorous.
exactly as it needed to be for a growing institution, right? So I had built an information governance program. The company started to experiment with artificial intelligence. So when I built the information governance program, when I built the data governance program, I made it modular so that all of the things that I had built could be purposed for multiple different things. So, data governance is at the core, then you add on content management, records and information management, data protection, privacy, and artificial intelligence governance was, on the periphery. So when you start doing things like managing models to help you to understand um, alternative means for credit worthiness, things that are outside of a Fair Isaac score or something like that. You need to start putting guardrails around that to make sure that there's some semblance of understanding of some of the ethics around doing so, some of the potential impacts.
I'm curious. So, is that the kind of thing that the regulators are focused on? Because it seems like a so. I mean, they they can make a recommendation based on a certain type of data and whether you're keeping it and how long you're keeping it and how it's informa. Is it anonymized or not anonymized? Things like that.
So there are things called FFIEC guidelines, and those are guidelines that are put together um, by regulatory agencies that help you to understand what they believe is important. Now, those guidelines don't mention data governance at all. There is no mention of that whatsoever. However, what regulatory agencies do is they look at the overall corpus of a regulation and they draw they draw generalized conclusions that they can give fairly specific recommendations on, right? So they'll say things like, "Oh, so you have a lot of models and tools that you're using to help you to make decisions regarding your expected credit loss," right? Which is a federally mandated program that each financial institution has that. Um, so uh, if you have those models and tools and you're not managing those models and tools and the associated risk of them, that's a problem, right? So they will say, why are you, that they, meaning the regulatory agency, will say, why aren't you managing the risk associated with those models and tools? And oh, by the way, how do you know that the data that you're feeding into those models and tools is the appropriate data to be feeding and of the appropriate quality, right? So how do you know it's the right data at the right time for the right usage and the right format, for this expected output? So they'll say, what are you doing for data governance, right? So they'll draw that conclusion down to, what's your data look like. Artificial intelligence is the same thing. So if you're building, say a machine learning, model, and you start training it on a series of data sets, they will come back
They're gonna ask you, where's the provenance of that data?
exactly, exactly. So what I do, I built Paperkite, not only from my experience at Northwest, but my experience at American Electric Power and OCLC, to specifically put together programs for clients that follows and specifically looking at regulated industries, but that's not the only reason. You should have questions answered on, regarding speed to value. Like, are you actually achieving strategic goals and objectives? But also looking at, okay, so what are the potential impacts that are associated with what you're suggesting that you do? that you want to do, with
So is
artificial.
paper? I know Paperkite is your new company. Is it so? Is Paperkite have a product, or is it pure services, or is it both?
It's pure service. But what I come in with is I already have, frameworks, operating models, policies, standards, guidelines, and a way to actually implement those within an organization. So, like what I did for my previous employer, and it's not like I would suggest, every company follow the same model, but it just so happened that it worked out well for my previous employer, where I built this modular system, and everything kind of built on top of this modular system. Now, that's something that I would recommend for companies that are of a specific size. So, if you're, say, like a mid tier organization, you don't have enough people to throw into multiple committees. Keep them in the same committee, build a series of subcommittees that are really focused on specific areas. So if you've got, data protection issues, have a subcommittee for that, right? So make sure your legal team is involved, your cybersecurity, risk. Um, if it's something that's specifically like content management or records and information management, yeah, you would have, people that, operate your CMS like Nautilus or, SharePoint, whatever, um, you know, have them involved in that committee and then just report out to people who, need to, be involved when they need to be involved, like legal, HR, ethics and compliance, right? So it's a very modular system, very modular approach, which works very well for small and mid-tier organizations.
Do you find? Did you, I'm curious. Did Northwest have a mainframe?
The AS400.
Oh, oh wow. Oh, okay. All right, got it. All
So
right, I
so
see.
the kind of like a mainframe adjacent, not at all a
Yeah,
mainframe.
yeah, yeah. It's sort of a old-fashioned mini. It's a mini computer with a custom operating system, but also that probably. I mean, although now they can run pretty much all that. Oracle 9 could probably run on it or something like
Yes,
that. But
absolutely,
I
absolutely.
see.
Yeah, it's highly capable.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Very, very much so. That's interesting. Is Paperkite focused on financial services customers, or or could you be in healthcare, or in any other industry?
All regulated industries. So banking, finance, healthcare, insurance, utilities, anything that is regulated. I do have experience in all of those areas. Now a little less in healthcare, but I've been, healthcare light for almost my entire career. So, uh, yeah, or healthcare adjacent for almost my entire career. Um, but yeah, I focus on small to mid tier in the regulated space. It's not necessarily just because, there's, AI regulation, even though it exists in 30 states, but a lot of the principles that are associated with AI regulation that's in those states are basically just good practices, right? So might as well follow good practices and, you're pretty well assured to be compliant with those regulatory requirements.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting to me that at least what I've been reading about AI usage in corporations, specifically now, let's say with the chatbots and things like that, is there's it's so the learning models and the data that the learning models use to train on is such a black box that it's almost like these companies can't really use those public products. They started out by saying, "Oh, you can put it on your computer and use it," but now in a regulated industry, they're like saying, "No, no, 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 no. We're going to have to stand up our own language model to our own data that we have to be responsible for." It's a lot of what you and I could run ChatGPT on our computer or our phone and do a lot, but that is not going to be what the standard of business is going to be.
Yeah, there's a difference between, what your use case, and this is what your use case is, and this is something that I help organizations with is to to define exactly what it is that you're trying to do. If you're trying to achieve some sort of competitive parity by, trying to become a little bit more efficient in your operations, that's one thing. You can start a co-pilot initiative or something like that to help, say, write marketing copy a little bit more efficiently. Okay, that's great. Yep. But if it's something that you're trying to extend your, core competencies on, that's another story. Then you start looking at, what the real return on investment is and what your actual risks are associated with that. And what a lot of companies are finding is that, they're not able to segment off well enough the right data without using specific technologies like large language model firewalls, where you can achieve, greater control over your input and output and who can actually see your input and output. But the model itself does tend to be a little bit of a black box, and it remains to be seen from regulatory agencies. If they say, well, you have to be able to explain what is happening in that model that gave you that output. And there are tools that can help you to do that. There's a whole study of, or a whole conceptual area, called XAI, or explainable artificial intelligence, that can help you to do that. So you can use, more publicly available models, but your point is very well made, that you do still have to show your work. I mean, you have to come into work with or to school with two sharpened pencils and show your math. But your ability to use some of these XAI tools does not exonerate you from doing the hard work.
Yeah, that's why I think that the class of AI-based companies, that are gonna be purpose-built for specific industries
Mhm.
are gonna have to have a lot of control over the data that they see. Like, if you think about it, when you start using a diagnostic system for healthcare, right? And you're gonna walk in and you're gonna get, let's say, a preliminary diagnosis from an AI before you see the doctor. To actually accomplish that, that's a huge investment in data modeling and data protection, because all that information that you're going to get, let's say the history based upon some symptom, you got to know where that's coming from.
Right.
That can't be off of the general internet. That's going to have to come from trials and double blind tests, and the kind of thing that drug companies do all the time now.
Right, and that goes back to our early conversation about having some control over that data that feeds into those models, right? That's the whole data governance and, sliding into the information governance conversation that we had following that. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
Well, Todd, it was a pleasure, and I learned something. It's funny how we could both spend a long time in our career, and although we're sort of like at this level here, right? It's fascinating though. But it was really interesting to talk to you and spend the time, and maybe our paths will cross another time.
I hope so. It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much, Mark.